The blood oath was broken the moment Kiva held her sister's newborn son in her arms and knew she would never give him back. The royal decree had been clear. Pack law demanded it. Any child born of the forbidden bloodline between Alpha Fiacra of the Northern Reaches and Omega Sorka of the Ashwood territory would belong to the throne, would be raised as heir to a kingdom built on the bones of their ancestors' wars, would never know the mother who bore them or the aunt who loved them both. But Kiva looked into those amber eyes, her sister's eyes, not his, and made a choice that would condemn them all. Tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because what comes next will break something inside you that you didn't know could break. The child's name was Oshin. 3 days old when Kiva wrapped him in wolf fur and shadows, when she kissed her sister's fevered forehead and whispered the lie that would echo through generations. He's gone, she said. The fever took him in the night. And Sorka, broken and bleeding from a birth that should have killed her, believed. Because why wouldn't she? Her sister had never lied to her before. Her sister had been the one constant in a life shattered by pack politics and an alpha's obsession disguised as destiny. The labor had lasted 37 hours. 37 hours of Sorka screaming while her body tried to expel a child it wasn't ready to carry. The healers had warned her that bearing an alpha's heir at 19 was dangerous. That her body hadn't finished developing. That waiting another year, maybe 2, would give her better odds of survival. But Fiacra hadn't wanted to wait. Had orchestrated the heat cycle with calculated precision. Had ensured he was the only alpha present when her body betrayed her with needs she couldn't control. Had claimed the bond while she was too lost in biological imperative to refuse. That's how Oshin came to exist. Not through love or even genuine desire, but through manipulation dressed up as destiny. Through an alpha who confused ownership with affection and saw a child as proof of conquest rather than as a person deserving better origins. Kiva had watched her sister disappear over those 3 years. Had watched Sorka's light dim as Fiacra's presence became increasingly oppressive. Had heard her cry in the night when she thought no one was listening. Had seen the bruises that weren't quite bruises, the kind that came from being held too tightly by someone who didn't understand that love should never leave marks. So when Oshin was born, when Kiva held this perfect, innocent child who had done nothing wrong except be conceived through coercion, she made a choice. The wrong choice. The necessary choice. The choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She waited until Sorka fell into the exhausted sleep that follows traumatic birth. Waited until the midwives had gone to prepare the traditional blessing ceremony. Waited until she was alone with the child and the magnitude of what she was about to do. Then she wrapped him carefully. Spoke a concealment spell over his small body. The kind of magic that ran in their family line, that made observers see only what they expected to see. And she carried him out through the back passages of the birthing house, through the forest paths she had known since childhood, to the cottage that existed in the spaces between mapped territories. The cottage had belonged to their grandmother Mwern, who had been a seer and a healer and the kind of wolf who understood that sometimes survival required operating outside pack law. It was warded against casual discovery, protected by magic older than the Council of Territories. And it was exactly the kind of place where a stolen child could grow up hidden from the world that wanted to claim him. Kiva had spent 3 months preparing it, stocking supplies, reinforcing the wards, creating a space where she could raise Oshin in secret while maintaining her public life in Ashwood territory. She had thought of everything, every contingency, every possible complication, except she hadn't thought about what it would feel like to watch Sorka grieve. Hadn't anticipated the way her sister's wolf would howl for 3 days straight, a sound that carried across territories and made even hardened warriors weep. Hadn't prepared for the guilt that would settle into her bones like poison and never quite leave. But she had committed to this path, had made her choice. And Kiva was nothing if not devastatingly committed to seeing her choices through to their terrible conclusions. Fiacra arrived at dawn on the 4th day. And the sound of his rage could be heard 3 territories over. He came with 20 wolves. His beta ruark, his personal guard, his advisors and counselors and every ranking member of the Northern Reaches who had invested in the political implications of this heir. They descended on Ashwood like a conquering army, and for a moment it seemed like the fragile peace between territories would shatter entirely. He tore through the Ashwood settlement demanding answers, demanding to see his son, demanding explanations for how an alpha's heir could simply die without warning or witness. The Ashwood alpha, a grizzled wolf named Brendan, tried to maintain order, tried to remind Fiacre that pack law forbade this kind of aggressive posturing in another territory settlement. But Fiacre was beyond caring about protocol, beyond respecting boundaries, beyond anything except the raw fury of a man who had lost his leverage. Because that's what Oisin had been to him. Leverage. A living claim on Sorcha that would last decades. A reason to maintain contact, to insert himself into her life, to never let go of the bond he had forced on her. The child was never about fatherhood, was never about family, was only about possession extended into the next generation. Kiva understood this in her bones. Understood that Fiacre's grief was really anger at having his control disrupted. Understood that his demands to see the body were less about mourning and more about verification. About making sure this wasn't some trick. Some Ashwood deception designed to deny him his prize. So when he finally made his way to Sorcha's bedside, when he stood over the woman he had claimed and demanded answers, Kiva was ready. She had prepared the evidence carefully. Burned infant-sized bones that she had acquired through means she preferred not to examine too closely. Mixed them with ash and the remnants of blankets, and the kind of ritual trappings that would suggest a traditional Ashwood funeral. Had scattered them at the sacred burning grounds where pack members had been cremated for generations. "Where is the body?" Fiacre demanded. His voice granite and growl as he loomed over Sorcha's bed. "I will see my son." Sorcha couldn't answer. The grief had stolen her voice along with everything else. She could only turn her face to the wall and shake with silent sobs that came from somewhere too deep for sound. It was Kiva who stepped forward. Kiva who had prepared for this confrontation with the kind of meticulous planning that comes from knowing you're committing an unforgivable act. "We burned him at moonrise, as is our custom. You have no claim on ashes, Alpha." Title was a blade between them. A reminder that he may rule the northern reaches with absolute authority. But here in Ashwood, he was only a visitor. Only the man who had destroyed her sister. Only someone whose grief, however loud, didn't supersede their territorial customs. Fiacre's eyes, silver shot through with gold, beautiful and terrible, fixed on her with an intensity that would have brought lesser wolves to their knees. Would have made them confess. Would have shattered any deception through sheer force of will. But Kiva was not lesser. Was not weak. Was her grandmother's granddaughter, with all the iron will and moral flexibility that implied. "You're lying," he said with absolute conviction. "Prove it," Kiva said softly. Only. With the kind of quiet challenge that dared him to make the exact mistake she was betting on. "Tear apart our sacred grounds. Violate our burial customs. Desecrate the resting place of every Ashwood wolf who has died in the last 3 centuries. Show the council exactly what kind of alpha breaks tradition for the ghost of an heir who was never truly yours to begin with." It was checkmate and they both knew it. The Council of Territories would never support him if he violated sacred grounds. Pack law might grant him certain rights to his biological child, but those rights evaporated at the boundary of religious custom and territorial sovereignty. If he dug up the burning grounds, if he scattered sacred ash in his search, he would lose the moral high ground that made his claim legitimate. And Fiacre was many things. Obsessive, controlling, willing to manipulate situations to his advantage. But he wasn't stupid. He understood political calculations. Understood that winning this battle would cost him the larger war. That the council would turn against him. That other territories would see him as someone who couldn't be trusted to respect basic customs. That his entire power base would erode. So he made the only choice available to him. He retreated. But not before making it clear that this was a tactical withdrawal, not surrender. "This isn't over," he promised. His gaze cutting from Kiva to Sorcha and back again. "You were mine before. You're mine still. The bond doesn't break just because you wish it. Then he was gone, taking his fury and his 20 wolves and his shattered plans back to the northern reaches. Taking his grief, such as it was, back to his fortress in the mountains. Taking everything except the satisfaction of verification, which would gnaw at him for months, for years, for the rest of his life. Kiva exhaled for the first time in 4 days. Phase 1 was complete. She had successfully hidden Oshin's existence from the one wolf who would stop at nothing to claim him. Had protected Sorka from further manipulation. Had given her sister a chance at freedom, even if that freedom came wrapped in manufactured grief. Now came the truly impossible part. Raising an alpha's stolen heir in secret. Maintaining the deception while living a double life. Watching her sister drown in sorrow that Kiva herself had created. And doing all of this while Pack Law continued to operate around her, looking for any slip, any mistake, any reason to question the convenient death of such a politically valuable child. But there was one element she hadn't accounted for. One variable that would unravel everything she had built with such careful, terrible precision. The Omega named Lyaden, who had seen everything from the shadows, and who loved Fiacra with a desperation that would soon cost an innocent woman her life. Lyaden had been promised to Fiacra since she was 16 years old. The arrangement had been negotiated by her father Diarmuid, Alpha of the Eastern Valleys, and Fiacra's father Killian before he died. It was supposed to unite two powerful territories. Supposed to create the kind of alliance that would shift the balance of power across all Packlands. Supposed to give Lyaden everything she had been raised to expect. Status, security, and a mate whose strength matched her ambition. She had spent 2 years preparing for the role. Had learned the political intricacies of the northern reaches. Had studied their customs, their history, their expectations for an alpha's mate. Had practiced the kind of social maneuvering required to manage a territory that size. Had imagined their children, their future, the dynasty they would build together. And then Fiacra had attended the autumn gathering. Had seen Sorka across a crowded hall. And everything Lyaden had been promised evaporated like morning frost under sunlight. It's not personal, Fiacra had told her when he came to break their arrangement. When he stood in her father's great hall and dissolved a treaty that had taken years to negotiate. My wolf has chosen. I can't explain it better than that. But it was personal. How could it not be? Lyaden had spent 2 years building her entire identity around becoming Fiacra's mate. Had delayed other courtships, other opportunities, other potential futures because she was already spoken for. Because she believed, had been taught to believe, that promises made between alphas were sacred and binding. She had watched him pursue Sorka with the kind of single-minded obsession that should have been directed at her. Had watched him break treaties and ignore diplomatic consequences and generally behave like a lovesick fool for a woman who didn't even want him. Had watched her own future crumble because Fiacra's wolf had decided that an unwilling Omega from a minor territory was more desirable than the willing, trained, politically advantageous mate waiting for him. And the worst part. Sorka hadn't even wanted him. Had rejected his advances for 3 years. Had explicitly, repeatedly, publicly refused his claim. Yet somehow she was the one chosen. Somehow, her rejection made her more valuable than Lyaden's acceptance ever could be. The injustice of it festered. Brew. Became the kind of obsession that mirrors what it hates. Lyaden told herself she was over it. Told her father she understood. Told the Eastern Valleys pack that she was moving forward with dignity and grace. But privately, secretly she began to watch. Began to track every piece of information about Fiacra and Sorka. Began to wait for the moment when their doomed relationship would collapse and he would realize his mistake. When she heard about Sorka's pregnancy, Lyaden felt vindicated. See, this was what came from following wolf instinct instead of political sense. This was what happened when you let base attraction override strategic planning. Sorka was too young, too fragile, too unprepared for the demands of bearing an alpha's heir. The child would likely kill her. Would end this embarrassing chapter of Fiacra's life, and allow him to return to the arrangement that had always made sense. But Sorka survived. Barely, but she survived. And suddenly there was an heir. A living, breathing complication that would tie Fiacre to Sorka for decades. That would give him permanent leverage over her. That would make Laeden's hope of reconciliation even more impossible. Unless the child died. Laeden didn't wish for it. Not consciously. Not with deliberate intent. But when news reached the eastern valleys that Oisin had succumbed to fever, when she heard about the convenient death that freed Sorka from motherhood and Fiacre from his leverage, something in her relaxed, settled, felt like the universe correcting a mistake. She attended the memorial service as political courtesy demanded. Watched Fiacre rage and grieve with an intensity that seemed excessive for a man who had only known his son for 3 days. Watched Sorka dissolve into silent mourning that seemed almost theatrical in its completeness. Watched Kiva manage the arrangements with a kind of careful control that suggested either deep competence or deep guilt. And Laeden noticed something the others missed. Kiva never cried. Not once during the entire service. Not during the speeches or the rituals or the moments when even hardened warriors were wiping their eyes. She stood there with perfect composure, managing details, guiding her sister, playing the role of supportive family member with flawless precision. But her eyes were wrong. They held not grief but something else. Something that looked like determination. Like someone carrying a secret that required constant vigilance to maintain. Laeden filed this observation away. Paid attention when Kiva requested a leave of absence from pack duties shortly after. Noted when she moved to a remote cottage for solitary research that required minimal contact with the rest of Ashwood territory. Watched when supplies were delivered to that cottage in quantities that seemed excessive for one wolf living alone. It took her 3 months to confirm her suspicion. 3 months of careful surveillance and patient observation. 3 months of positioning herself in the forest near Kiva's cottage and waiting for any sign that her instincts were correct. Then one afternoon she saw it. Saw Kiva emerge from the cottage with a bundle in her arms. Saw that bundle move. Heard the small cry that no amount of concealment magic could fully suppress. Oisin was alive. The realization hit Laeden like physical impact. The child hadn't died. Kiva had stolen him. Had manufactured grief while raising Sorka's son in secret. Had violated pack law on a scale that should result in immediate exile. Had created a deception that made everyone, including Fiacre, look like fools. Most wolves would have reported this immediately. Would have alerted the council. Would have exposed the crime and let justice take its course. Laeden did none of these things. Because if Oisin was alive and hidden, that was information. That was power. That was leverage she could deploy at exactly the right moment to maximum effect. She could be the one to return Fiacre's lost heir. Could be the hero who exposed Ashwood's deception and vindicated the Northern Reach's suspicions. Could prove her value in ways that courtship and political treaties never could. Could make Fiacre finally see her. So she kept silent. And she waited. And she watched Kiva raise the stolen child with a kind of devoted care that made the whole situation even more perverse. Watched Oisin grow from infant to toddler in a cottage that didn't exist on any map. Watched Sorka continue to grieve a child who was alive and well less than 5 miles from where she slept. The deception was masterful. Kiva visited Ashwood territory regularly enough that no one questioned her absence. The concealment wards on the cottage were strong enough that casual searches found nothing. And Sorka was so lost in grief that she never questioned her sister's story. Never demanded to see the burial site. Never pushed for the kind of verification that would have unraveled everything. Laeden documented it all. Kept detailed records. Gathered evidence. Built a case that would be undeniable when she finally chose to reveal it. But she needed timing. Needed the perfect moment when exposure would cause maximum impact. When Fiacre would be most receptive to seeing her as valuable. When the revelation would position her not as vengeful but as righteous. 18 months. That's how long she waited. 18 months of watching and documenting and preparing. 18 months of Sorka's grief and Fiacre's rage and Kiva's deception. 18 months of Oisin growing in hidden safety while everyone mourned his ghost. Then came the spring gathering, when all territories would be present. When maximum witnesses would see her expose the greatest deception in modern pack history. When Fiachra would be surrounded by his people and unable to hide his reaction. When Laoden could finally step forward as the loyal Omega who had never stopped watching out for his interests. She arrived in Ashwood with 6 escort wolves and a formal petition to the council. Wore the traditional garb of the Eastern Valleys. Silver thread woven through midnight blue, the kind of clothing that announced status and importance before a word was spoken. Carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards and was about to play them to devastating effect. The great hall was packed when she requested an audience with Sorka. Pack law required that all formal petitions be heard by a territory's ranking Omega, which meant Sorka had to listen. Had to stand there while Laoden dismantled her entire life with careful precision. Sorka looked so small beside Laoden. Oh, faded. Like comparing moonlight to silver. Like comparing a ghost to something solid and real. 18 months of grief had hollowed her out until she was more shadow than substance. And part of Laoden felt something like pity looking at her. But pity wouldn't get her what she wanted. Wouldn't make Fiachra finally see her value. Wouldn't undo 2 years of humiliation and broken promises. So Laoden spoke the words that would change everything. You don't remember me. It wasn't a question. Sorka's voice was barely audible. Should I? We met once. 3 years ago at the autumn gathering. Before Fiachra claimed you. The bitterness in that last word could have etched glass. Could have drawn blood. Could have made the entire hall understand exactly how much this cost her. I was supposed to be his mate. Our packs had agreements, treaties, a future built on alliance rather than obsession. Sorka's expression didn't change. Grief had made her untouchable, made her impervious to implications and accusations, and anything that wasn't directly about the son she believed she'd lost. I didn't ask for his claim. Well, but you accepted it eventually, didn't you? Bore his child. Gave him an heir. Laoden stepped closer, and her wolf was present in every movement. Dominant, territorial, dangerous despite the Omega designation that should have made her submissive. Except the child didn't die, did he? The silence that followed was absolute. Around them the Ashwood pack stilled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Even the ancient rafters of the great hall seemed to lean in, waiting for what came next. Sorka's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. What did you say? I said your son is alive. Hidden by your sister. Raised as her own while you've been drowning in false grief. Laoden pulled a small object from her robes. A carved wooden wolf, the kind crafted for teething alpha children. She had taken it from Kiva's cottage during one of her surveillance missions. Had kept it for exactly this moment. This was found near Kiva's cottage. It still carries his scent. And I've had it verified by the Eastern Valley's best tracker. That's Fiachra's bloodline. That's the forbidden bloodline. That's your son. The wooden wolf clattered to the stone floor with a sound like bones breaking. Sorka didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't breathe. But something behind her eyes shifted. A crack in ice that had been frozen solid for 18 months. The beginning of an avalanche that would bury everything in its path. The entire hall was watching her. Waiting for her reaction. Waiting to see if she would deny or confirm or simply shatter under the weight of this revelation. But it was Kiva's voice that cut through the silence first. You're lying. She had entered the hall from a side entrance. Drawn by some instinct that disaster was unfolding. Drawn by the sense that every carefully constructed protection she had built was about to collapse. Drawn by the terrible certainty that her 18 months of deception had just reached their inevitable conclusion. Oisin was back at the cottage with their mother Bibin. Hidden. Protected by wards and distance and the remnants of Kiva's careful planning. But for how much longer? Laoden's smile was poisonous grace. Was triumph barely contained? Was the expression of someone who had waited 18 months for this exact moment and was savoring every second? Am I? Then you won't mind if we search your cottage. If we bring the council's investigation team to verify my claims. If we test this toy for scent markers and bloodline traces and all the other forensic magic that will prove exactly what I'm saying. Pack law forbids unsanctioned searches. Pack law forbids hiding in Alpha's heir. Lyaden interrupted. The words came fast now, practiced, perfect. She had rehearsed this speech dozens of times. Had anticipated every objection and prepared every counter-argument. The moment you stole that child, you voided any protection territory rights might grant you. And when the council discovers what you've done, Ashwood will be stripped of its autonomy. Sorka will be declared unfit. And Fiacre will have every legal right to claim not just his son, but your entire territory as recompense for the deception. It was masterful, ruthless, brilliant in its cruelty. Lyaden had orchestrated a scenario where everyone lost except her. Where Fiacre would be so grateful for the return of his stolen heir that he might finally see her. Might finally grant her the bond she had been denied. Might finally understand that she was the one who had been loyal all along. Where Kiva would face exile or worse. Where Sorka would be revealed as the mother who hadn't even known her child was alive. Where Ashwood would lose its territorial rights. Where everything Kiva had built would crumble into dust and legal consequences. Kiva looked at her sister. At Sorka's face, where grief was transforming into something far more dangerous. Realization. Recognition. Wait, Sorka, she began. Is it true? Sorka's voice was steady now. Too steady. The voice of a woman who had already lost everything and was now discovering there were still further depths to fall. Still worse betrayals to endure. Still more pain waiting beyond what she thought was the limit of human suffering. Is my son alive? Every eye in the great hall turned to Kiva. Every wolf's instinct attuned to this moment of confession or denial that would reshape pack politics for generations. Every breath held. Every heartbeat suspended. Every possible future balanced on the edge of whatever words came next. Kiva could lie. Could deny. Could buy herself more time, more options, more anything. Could accuse Lyaden of fabrication motivated by jealousy. Could demand formal investigation through proper channels. Could deploy every legal protection and territorial right available to her. But she looked at her sister, really looked at her, and saw the moment 18 months of grief had built toward. The moment where truth, however terrible, was the only path forward. The moment where another lie would be the final betrayal from which their relationship could never recover. The word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would never stop spreading. Yes, Oshin lives. The sound Sorka made wasn't quite a scream. It was something older. Something that predated language and civilization and pack law. It was every mother's rage at having her child stolen, wrapped in the unique agony of discovering the thief was the person she trusted most. It was betrayal and fury and 18 months of manufactured grief all released in one primal howl. Then Sorka was moving. Shifting mid-stride into her wolf form. Gray and silver. Built for endurance rather than dominance. Beautiful in the way of wild things that survive despite everything. She launched herself at Kiva with teeth bared and claws extended and 18 months of false grief fueling every ounce of her fury. Kiva didn't defend herself. Didn't shift. Didn't run. Didn't raise her hands to block or deflect or protect herself in any way. She stood still and let her sister's claws open 3 lines across her face. Let the blood run hot and red down her cheek and neck. Let the pain anchor her to this moment of consequence she had spent so long avoiding. Let the marks brand her as what she was, a thief who had stolen the most precious thing from someone who had already lost too much. I'm sorry, she whispered as wolves pulled Sorka back, as her sister's howls echoed through the hall and into the mountains beyond and across territories that would all hear about this before nightfall. I thought I was saving him. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was doing the right thing. But salvation, like love, is meaningless without consent. And Kiva had stolen both. Sorka struggled against the wolves holding her back. Struggled with the kind of desperate strength that comes from mothers whose children are threatened. struggled until Brendan himself had to intervene, using his alpha command to force her to stillness she didn't choose. Enough. His voice carried the weight of authority and deep disappointment. This is a matter for the council now. Not for violence. Not for vengeance. For justice. Lyaden stood to the side, watching her plan unfold exactly as she had engineered it. Watching Sorka's pain and Kiva's guilt and the Ashwood Pack's growing anger at the deception that had been practiced on them all. Watching Fiachra's claim to his son suddenly become legally undeniable and impossible to refuse. This was supposed to be her moment of triumph. Her vindication. The beginning of the future she had been denied 3 years ago. But looking at Sorka's face, at the raw devastation there, something in Lyaden's chest twisted uncomfortably. Something that might have been guilt if she had let herself feel it. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, winning this way would cost more than she had anticipated. She pushed the feeling away. Focused on the goal. On Fiachra's gratitude. On finally being seen and chosen and valued the way she deserved. The council would convene within days. Would rule on Kiva's crime and Oisin's custody and the future of territorial relations. Would give Lyaden everything she had worked for. Would make all of this worthwhile. Or so she told herself as Sorka's howls continued to echo through the great hall and Kiva's blood dripped onto ancient stone and the Ashwood Pack began to understand the magnitude of the deception that had been practiced in their name. The story was only beginning. And already, everyone involved would pay prices they couldn't yet imagine. The Council of Territories convened within 48 hours, as was their right when Pack law was violated on this scale. They met in neutral territory, the standing stones at the center of all 4 regions, where ancient magic kept violence at bay and truth-telling was enforced by bonds older than any wolf's memory. 7 alphas, 7 omegas, 7 betas. 21 wolves who would decide the fate of a stolen child, a broken mother, a sister who had committed unforgivable mercy, and an alpha whose claim had been denied through deception. The standing stones were exactly what their name suggested. 7 massive pillars of granite that had been placed in a perfect circle sometime before recorded Pack history began. They hummed with old magic. The kind that made even the most dominant alpha uncomfortable. The kind that enforced truth with consequences that made lying physically impossible within their boundary. It was the closest thing Pack society had to absolute authority. What was decided at the standing stones was binding. Irrevocable. Final. Fiachra arrived like winter made flesh. He had aged in 18 months. New lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. New silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. A hardness in his expression that suggested the grief had changed something fundamental about who he was. But the rage was fresh. Was immediate. Was barely contained beneath a thin veneer of civilized behavior. When he learned his son lived, when Lyaden had sent word to the northern reaches about the discovery, something in him had broken and reformed into something sharper. Something that cared less about protocol and more about recovering what had been stolen from him. He came with his full complement of advisors and guards. With Ruark at his side looking grim and resigned to whatever was about to unfold. With the political machinery of the northern reaches ready to defend his claim through every legal avenue available. But there was something else beneath the rage. Something Kiva recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror every day for 18 months. Something that looked disturbingly like guilt. Because Fiachra hadn't wanted a son. Not really. Not in the way that fathers are supposed to want children, as people to love and guide and watch grow. He had wanted proof. Wanted a living symbol that would tie Sorka to him forever. Wanted a reason to maintain control over a woman whose wolf called to his in ways that defied political convenience, but who had never wanted the bond he forced on her. The child had been a tool. Political move. A way to bind an Omega who had explicitly rejected his claim. And now that child was real. Was named Oisin. Was 18 months old with amber eyes and a laugh that Kiva had heard hundreds of times. Was no longer theoretical but actual, with preferences and personality and the kind of trust that only exists in children who have been loved. Fiachra hadn't prepared for that. Hadn't imagined that the heir he had grieved for 18 months would be an actual person rather than a symbol. Hadn't considered what it would mean to claim a child who had no memory of him and every reason to fear the disruption he represented. None of them had prepared for that. Sorka arrived looking like she might shatter at the slightest touch. Her mother Bibin supported her physically, an arm around her waist, keeping her upright. She had barely eaten in the 2 days since the revelation, had refused to see Kiva, had alternated between rage and grief and a kind of numb shock that suggested her mind was protecting her from the full weight of what she had learned. Her son was alive, had been alive all this time, had been growing and changing and becoming a person while she drowned in grief for a ghost, had been within reach while she believed him ash and memory, had been stolen by the person she trusted most, for reasons she couldn't yet understand or forgive. The betrayal was absolute, was overwhelming, was the kind of thing that breaks people permanently if they're not careful. But Sorka had survived Fiakra's obsession, had survived a birth that should have killed her, had survived 18 months of grief that would have destroyed lesser wolves. She would survive this too, even if she couldn't yet imagine how. Kiva arrived alone. She had been formally separated from the Ashwood pack pending the council's ruling, had been stripped of her territory rights and her family connections and everything except the clothes she wore and the guilt that was eating her alive from the inside. The 3 lines across her face, Sorka's marks, had been left to heal naturally. Pack healers could have erased them within hours, but Kiva had refused treatment. The scars would be permanent, visible, a reminder of the price of her choices every time she looked in a mirror. She deserved far worse, and she knew it. Laedan arrived dressed for victory. Traditional Eastern Valleys garb in silver and blue. Hair braided in the intricate patterns that announced availability for mating. Expression carefully neutral but eyes bright with anticipation of how this would unfold. How Fiakra would finally see her value. How everything she had lost would be restored with interest. She positioned herself near the northern reaches contingent. Near enough to Fiakra that association was implied. Near enough that everyone watching would understand she was aligned with his interests rather than neutral in this dispute. And the child, Oshin himself, was brought wrapped in blankets and held by Bibin. He looked around the circle of 21 intimidating wolves with wide amber eyes, not understanding that his existence had become trial and verdict all at once. Not understanding that his future, his entire life, was being decided by strangers who had never held him or heard him laugh or wiped his tears. Fiakra stood frozen. Just stood there, staring at the son he had spent 18 months mourning, and something in his expression cracked. "He has your eyes," he said to Sorka. His voice was rough with emotions he didn't know how to name. "I always thought he would have mine." Sorka didn't respond. She hadn't spoken since the revelation in the Great Hall. Hadn't shifted back from the wolf form she had taken when attacking Kiva. She sat at the edge of the circle with her head on her paws, watching Oshin with an intensity that bordered on feral. The head alpha of the council was a wolf named Nawaz from the Southern Shore territories. He was ancient by pack standards, nearly 70 years old, and had presided over more council judgments than anyone currently living. His word carried weight that transcended political alliances or territorial loyalty. He looked at each party in turn. At Fiakra and his barely contained rage. At Sorka in her wolf form, silent and watching. At Kiva with her scarred face and guilty eyes. At Laedan with her carefully constructed neutrality. At Oshin innocent and unaware. Then he spoke, and his voice carried across the standing stones with the authority of centuries. "We are here to determine the fate of a child stolen through deception and the consequences for those who participated in that deception. But before we can rule on custody and punishment, we must first examine the circumstances that led to this moment. The bond between Alpha Fiakra and Omega Sorka. The conception of the child Oshin. The motivations that drove Kiva to commit theft on this scale." He turned to Fiakra. "Tell us about your bond with Sorka. How it was formed. Whether it was consensual." Fiakra's jaw tightened. She rejected my claim initially. For 3 years. But when her heat came, I was present. I was the only alpha present. And she accepted the bond during that time. During her heat, Nawaz repeated slowly. When her biology made refusal nearly impossible. When you had positioned yourself as the only option available to her. It was destiny, Fiacre said, but his voice lacked conviction. My wolf chose her. Or you orchestrated circumstances to give her no choice, one of the Omega Council members said. Her name was Siofra, and she ruled a small territory to the east with a kind of iron will that made even alphas respect her authority. Heat robs us of choice, Alpha Fiacre. You know this. We all know this. And yet you positioned yourself as the only option available to an Omega in crisis. I didn't force. Didn't you? Siofra's voice was soft but cutting. 3 years of pursuit despite explicit rejection. Strategic positioning during her most vulnerable biological moment. A child conceived under circumstances where true consent was impossible. Tell me, Alpha, what part of that resembles the kind of bond that should be protected by pack law? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Laedan felt her carefully constructed plan beginning to fracture. This wasn't supposed to be about Fiacre's methods. This was supposed to be about Kiva's crime. About returning the stolen heir. About positioning herself as the loyal Omega who had exposed the deception. But the council was doing something she hadn't anticipated. They were examining the bond itself. Questioning whether Oshin should have been conceived at all. Challenging the very foundation of Fiacre's claim. The law is clear, Laedan said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. An alpha's heir belongs to the alpha. Regardless of how the bond was formed, the child exists. And Kiva stole him. That's the crime we're here to judge. Nawaz turned his ancient eyes on her. And who are you to speak in this proceeding, Laedan of the Eastern Valleys? I'm the one who discovered the deception. Who brought evidence to the council. Who has personal interest in the outcome, Siofra interrupted. Who was promised to Fiacre before he chose Sorka. Who has spent 3 years waiting for an opportunity to insert herself back into his life. Laedan's careful neutrality cracked. That's not. I'm here for justice. Are you? Or are you here because you think exposing this crime will make Fiacre finally see you as valuable? Because you think returning his stolen son will earn you the bond you were denied? The words were surgical in their precision. Were designed to expose Laedan's true motivations in front of the entire council. Were calculated to undermine every claim she had made about acting righteously. And they worked. Fiacre looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since she had revealed Oshin's existence. And his expression was complicated. Was understanding and disappointment and something that might have been pity all mixed together. Is that what this is about? He asked quietly. You thought if you gave me back my son I would finally choose you. Laedan couldn't answer. Couldn't speak. Could only stand there while her carefully constructed plan dissolved into humiliation. I'm sorry, Fiacre said, and he actually sounded like he meant it. I'm sorry I broke our arrangement. I'm sorry I hurt you. But manipulating this situation to win my attention is not going to change what happened 3 years ago. My wolf chose Sorka. Not because you weren't worthy. Not because you did anything wrong. But because sometimes attraction defies logic and political convenience. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with realization. Just like sometimes obsession disguises itself as destiny. Sometimes we convince ourselves that wanting something badly enough makes it right. And sometimes we cause terrible harm while telling ourselves we're following our hearts. He looked at Sorka, still in wolf form, still watching Oshin with desperate intensity. I forced a bond you never wanted. Manipulated circumstances to give you no choice. Conceived a child as leverage to keep you tied to me. And I told myself it was destiny. That my wolf's choice justified everything. That eventually you would see what I saw and understand that we were meant to be together. His voice cracked. But watching you grieve for 18 months, believing our son was dead because I had pushed too hard, too fast, too selfishly, I started to understand what I had really done. Not created a bond. Created a prison. And the worst part. I was mourning the loss of chains I had forced on you, not the loss of a child I barely knew. The confession was devastating in its honesty. Sorka shifted then. Slowly, painfully, she returned to human form. Someone wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, but she didn't seem to notice. She just stared at Fiacre with eyes that held 18 months of grief and 3 years of coerced bondage and a lifetime of stolen choices. You destroyed me, she said simply. Not with violence. Not with obvious cruelty. But with relentless pursuit disguised as romance. With obsession dressed up as devotion. With a bond one never wanted but couldn't escape because you made sure I had no other option. I know, Fiacre said. And I'm sorry. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But I'm sorry. Sorka turned to Kiva. To her sister with the scarred face and guilty eyes. And you, she said. You saw what he was doing to me. Saw how he was destroying me piece by piece. And instead of helping me fight him, instead of giving me tools to resist, you stole my child. Made me grieve a ghost. Let me drown in false sorrow while you played mother to my son. Her voice broke. You both took my choices. You both decided you knew better. You both loved me in ways that left me with nothing. The accusation landed like a blade. Kiva bowed her head. Accepted the judgment. Accepted that salvation without consent is just another form of violation. Nawaz let the silence stretch. Let every wolf present sit with the weight of what had been confessed. Let the truth settle into bones and memory. Then he spoke again, and his words would reshape Pack law for generations. This council rules as follows. The bond between Fiacre and Sorka is declared non-consensual and therefore invalid under Pack law. Sorka is released from all claims, all obligations, all connections to the northern reaches. She is free. Fiacre closed his eyes, nodded, accepted what he had known was coming. The child Oshin will remain with his mother Sorka, who will raise him within Ashwood territory without interference from Fiacre or the northern reaches. However, supervised visitation will be granted, pending Fiacre's completion of Pack counseling regarding consent and bonding ethics. Sorka didn't react. Just kept watching Oshin with an intensity that suggested she would never let him out of her sight again. Kiva of Ashwood will be barred from contact with a child for a period of 5 years, with possibility of reassessment based on Sorka's discretion. Her actions, while criminal under Pack law, were motivated by genuine concern for her sister's well-being. This does not excuse the crime but provides context for a measured punishment rather than exile. Kiva's shoulders sagged with relief. 5 years felt like forever, but it wasn't permanent banishment. Wasn't complete loss. And Laeden of the Eastern Valleys will be censured for manipulation of council proceedings for personal gain. Her evidence was legitimate, but her motivations were not. She is reminded that Pack law serves justice, not jealousy. Laeden felt her face burn with humiliation. This was supposed to be her triumph, her vindication. Instead, she was being publicly shamed for the desperation everyone had seen but she had tried to hide. Nawaz looked at them all, at the broken bonds and stolen children and decades of choices made for others rather than with them. Let this be a lesson to all territories, he said. Love without consent is violence. Protection without permission is theft. And destiny is not an excuse to override someone else's autonomy. We are wolves, yes, but we are also people. And people deserve better than to be claimed, stolen, or manipulated by those who believe love justifies everything. The ruling was final. The council dispersed. And the 5 of them, Fiacre, Sorka, Kiva, Laeden and Oshin, were left to navigate the wreckage of choices that had seemed justified at the time but had cost everyone more than anyone anticipated. Sorka took her son from Bibin's arms, held him close, felt his weight and warmth and reality after 18 months of believing he was ash. Felt rage and relief and grief all tangled together in ways she couldn't separate. She looked at Kiva one last time. 5 years, she said. Don't contact me. Don't ask about him. Don't try to explain or apologize or make this better. Just stay away. Then she turned and walked away, taking Oshin with her, leaving Kiva standing alone with her scars and her guilt and the knowledge that sometimes love destroys what it tries to protect. Fiacre watched them go. Watched his son disappear into a future he would barely be part of. Watched the woman he had obsessed over finally walk away free. And felt something that might have been relief beneath the grief. Laëden stood apart from them all. Stood alone with the ruins of her plan and the public exposure of her desperation. Stood facing the truth that obsession had cost her dignity, reputation, and any chance of the future she had imagined. But she was still standing. Was still breathing. Was still alive to make different choices. The question was whether she would. 3 months later, something happened that no one anticipated. Laëden disappeared. She left the eastern valleys without permission, without guard, without any of the traditional notices required when an Omega travels between territories. Her father Diarmuid sent search parties. Found nothing. Reported her missing to the council. It was Sorka who realized the truth first. She was settling into motherhood with the cautious wonder of someone recovering from amputation who discovers they can still walk. Oshin was adjusting to her presence with the resilience of the very young. And slowly, so slowly, Sorka was remembering who she had been before Fiacre's obsession had redefined her entire existence. But she was also having dreams. Dreams of Laëden walking into the deep woods. Dreams of Laëden standing at the edge of something dark and ancient. Dreams of Laëden holding something that shouldn't exist. A lock of Oshin's hair, a fragment of his blanket, something small but essential that carried his scent and his essence. When Sorka woke from the third such dream, she knew. Laëden was going to hurt her son. Not directly. Not physically. But through the kind of magic that existed in the old stories. Blood magic, sympathetic connections, curses that required only the smallest piece of a person to unmake them entirely. She went to Kiva, breaking the council's order because some threats were larger than law. Her sister was living at the edge of Ashwood territory now, in a small dwelling that felt less like home and more like penance. She looked up when Sorka appeared on her doorstep, and the hope that flashed across her face was heartbreaking in its desperation. Sorka. Laëden has something of Oshin's. Sorka's hands were shaking. They were always shaking now. I don't know how. I don't know what. But I can feel it. The dreams are warning me. She's going to hurt him. Kiva was on her feet immediately. What do you need? Not are you sure or, that's impossible. Or any of the dismissals another person might offer. Just immediate belief and immediate action. It was, Sorka realized, exactly why she had come here. Why despite everything, despite the theft and the lies and the 18 months of false grief, Kiva was still the person she trusted most when her son was in danger. Help me find her. Before she does whatever she's planning. They left within the hour. Told no one. Brought only basic supplies and the kind of magic that ran in their bloodline. Tracking spells, protection wards, the ability to speak with the old things in the forest that remembered when wolves were gods instead of simply shifters. They found Laëden 3 days later. Deep in the no man's land between territories where pack law held no sway and older rules applied. She had built a ritual circle from river stones and crow bones. In the center was a small cloth bundle. And yes, there was Oshin's scent on it, faint but undeniable. A piece of his blanket. A lock of his hair. The wooden wolf toy she had shown the council, now broken into pieces that corresponded to body parts in the kind of sympathetic magic that made even hardened wolves uncomfortable. You're too late, Laëden said without turning around. She was drawing symbols in the dirt, methodical and precise. By sunrise your son will sicken. By sunset he'll be dead. And Fiacre will know that Ashwood couldn't even protect the heir they stole. Why? Sorka's voice was raw with incomprehension. What did Oshin ever do to you? He exists. Laëden turned then, and her face was a portrait of obsession that made Fiacre's pursuit look like casual interest. He's proof that I wasn't enough. That even after 3 years of waiting, even after treaties and promises and everything my pack sacrificed, Fiacre chose you. Not because you were better or stronger or more suitable. But because his wolf decided you were mate material and I wasn't. So you're killing a child to punish his mother for being wanted. Kiva's voice was acid. That's your grand solution. I'm removing the obstacle. Once Oshin is gone, once Sorka is drowning in real grief instead of manufactured trauma, Fiacra will see. Will finally understand that I'm the one who's been loyal, who's been patient, who deserves his bond. It was delusional, catastrophically so. The kind of twisted logic that came from years of rejection fermenting into something toxic and dangerous. Sorka moved first, shifted mid-step and lunged for the ritual circle, trying to disrupt the stones before Laedan could complete whatever curse she was building. But Laedan had anticipated this, had warded the circle against wolf forms. Sorka hit invisible resistance and fell back with a yelp, her shoulder wrenching at an angle that promised lasting damage. Kiva went next, but not at Laedan. At the cloth bundle in the center. If she could destroy it, could burn it completely, the sympathetic link would break before the curse could take hold. She made it 3 steps before Laedan's knife caught her in the ribs. It wasn't a deep wound, but it didn't need to be. The blade was silver, and silver burned wolf flesh in ways that defied natural healing. Kiva went down hard, clutching her side as blood spread across her shirt in a dark bloom that looked black in the moonlight. I didn't want to hurt anyone, Laedan said, and she actually sounded regretful. I just wanted him to see me. Just wanted to be chosen once. Is that so wrong? Yes, Sorka said from the ground, still in wolf form, still trying to breach the wards through sheer desperate determination. When it cost someone their life, yes. Laedan returned to her drawing. Another minute, maybe 2, and the curse would be complete. And Kiva's wound was bleeding too heavily for her to interfere again. And Sorka couldn't breach the wards no matter how hard she tried. And there was no one else coming to stop this because they had told no one where they were going. Oshin was going to die because his mother and aunt had tried to rescue him alone. Then someone stepped out of the tree line and everything stopped. Fiacra looked at the scene before him. His former unwilling mate on the ground in wolf form, Kiva bleeding from a silver wound, the woman who should have been his wife drawing death magic in the dirt, and his expression was pure devastation. Laedan, what have you done? Her head snapped up. For a moment, just a moment, naked hope crossed her face. He had come. He had found her. Surely that meant something. Surely that proved he cared. I'm fixing this, she said desperately. Her voice cracking with the weight of 3 years of obsessive waiting. I'm removing the obstacle that stands between us. Once Oshin is gone. I didn't want this. Fiacra's voice was quiet, shattered, broken in ways that suggested he was finally understanding the full cost of his own obsessive pursuit 3 years ago. I never wanted this. You were supposed to be my political match. Convenient alliance. And when I met Sorka, when my wolf chose her, I thought you understood that sometimes these things happen. That sometimes attraction doesn't follow the plan. I waited 3 years. You waited for something that was never real. He moved closer, careful and slow, the way one approaches a dangerous animal backed into a corner. Sorry. For letting you hope when there was no hope to be had. For not being clear about what I felt or didn't feel. For whatever I did that made you think murdering a child was a solution to being unchosen. But this has to stop. You chose her, Laedan said, and her voice was breaking completely now, all her careful control dissolving into raw pain. You chose someone who didn't even want you over someone who would have done anything. Because love isn't a transaction, Fiacra interrupted gently. It's not payment for patience or loyalty or 3 years of waiting. It's not something you earn by being the right strategic choice or by proving your worth through devotion. And whatever I felt for Sorka, whatever obsessive, controlling, deeply flawed thing I convinced myself was destiny, it was never about you not being enough. Then what was it about? The question was a scream. What am I supposed to do with all these years of waiting? All this faithfulness to a promise you made and broke. All this time I spent becoming exactly what you needed, only to discover you needed someone else. Fiacra had no answer. Because there was no answer that would satisfy. No explanation that would make the rejection hurt less. No words that could give meaning to wasted years and broken promises, and the particular agony of being set aside for someone who didn't even want what you desperately craved. Some hurts don't heal. Some rejections don't come with closure. Some people wait their entire lives for someone to choose them and die still waiting. That's not romantic. It's not even tragic. Just waste. And Laoden was drowning in it. While they were talking, while Laoden's attention was fixed on Fiacre and the explanation she had waited 3 years to hear, Kiva made her choice. She crawled across the ground, inch by inch, bleeding and burning from the silver wound. Determined in the way that only comes from knowing you're about to do something that can't be undone. She reached the cloth bundle, grabbed it with hands slick with her own blood, and before anyone could stop her, she threw it directly into her chest wound. Blood magic requires blood. Sympathetic curses follow bloodlines and scent markers. And if the blood touching the cursed items belonged to Kiva instead of Oshin, if the magical signature confused aunt for nephew, then the death magic would redirect, would take the wrong target entirely. Laoden watched in horror as her carefully constructed curse found an unintended host. As Kiva's body seized, as the magic that should have slowly sickened a child instead burned through an adult wolf with accelerated viciousness because the curse hadn't been designed for someone Kiva's age and size. No, Laoden whispered. No, that's not, I didn't want, I never meant. But intent doesn't matter in blood magic. Only connection. Only proximity. Only the terrible mathematics of power and consequence and what happens when curses find the wrong victim. Kiva was dying. Right there in the dirt. Dying to save her nephew from a curse cast by a woman who had loved too desperately and chosen too poorly. Fiacre dropped to his knees beside her. Sorka shifted back to human form and crawled to her sister's side. And for the first time in 18 months, the two of them knelt together over the woman who had stolen and saved and sacrificed in ways that defied easy judgment. I'm sorry, Sorka whispered, clutching her sister's hand. For the scars. For the rage. For not understanding that you were trying to protect me even when you were hurting me. I'm so sorry. Don't be. Kiva's voice was fading, each word requiring effort she barely had. You were right. I stole your choices. Made decisions that weren't mine to make. But I'd do it again. Would choose him. Would choose protecting Oshin over following rules that would have destroyed him. She looked at Fiacre. Take care of them. Both of them. And learn from my mistakes. Learn that loving someone doesn't give you the right to make their choices. Learn that protection without permission is just another form of control. Learn it better than I did. Then her eyes closed. And the curse took her. And Kiva died saving the child she had stolen, which was perhaps the only ending that made sense for a story built on choices both terrible and necessary. Laoden stood frozen, watching the death she had caused, watching her obsession manifest in blood and consequence, watching 3 years of waiting end in a woman's death and her own absolute damnation in the eyes of every wolf who would hear this story. Then she ran. Shifted mid-step and bolted into the forest, leaving behind the ritual circle and the dead woman and any chance she might have had at redemption or understanding or anything except exile and shame. Fiacre let her go. He had more important concerns. Had Sorka sobbing over her sister's body. Had a curse that needed proper dispelling to make sure no residual magic lingered. Had the terrible task of telling Oshin, someday when he was old enough to understand, that his aunt had died saving him from consequences he never deserved. They brought Kiva's body back to Ashwood. Burned her at the sacred grounds with full honors. Mourned her as both criminal and savior, which she had been in equal measure. Sorka stood at the funeral pyre and finally let herself grieve. For her sister. For the 18 months of false mourning. For all the choices stolen and given in the name of love that never quite learned to respect autonomy. And somewhere in the darkness beyond packed territories, Laoden ran, and ran, and ran. But she couldn't outrun what she had done. Couldn't escape the memory of Kiva dying from a curse meant for a child. Couldn't wash the blood from her hands or the obsession from her heart. Some said she died in the wilderness. unable to survive without pack support. Others claimed she went further, into territories where the old magic still ran strong and curses were currency, and wolves like her could disappear into shadows and never be found. But here's the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. Lyaden didn't die. He survived. Is surviving still. Is learning magic that makes blood curses look like child's play. Is waiting in the darkness beyond pack law's reach, nursing her obsession and her shame and her rage. Waiting for the day when Oshin has children of his own. When the forbidden bloodline continues. When she can return and finish what she started. Because obsession doesn't die just because its object moves on. Sometimes it metastasizes, grows, becomes something that outlives reason and sanity and every other limiting factor that keeps most wolves from crossing into true monstrosity. And somewhere beyond the territories, in the spaces between pack law and ancient magic, Lyaden waits, planning, preparing, counting the years until she can prove, once and for all, that she should have been chosen. But that's a story for another time. Another telling. Another moment when the fragile peace built on sacrifice and hard choices comes crashing down. For now, in this moment, there is only Sorka and Oshin. Only a mother finally freed to raise her son without manipulation or stolen choices. Only the slow, difficult work of healing from wounds that ran deeper than anyone knew. And in the end, isn't that what matters? Not the grand gestures or the dramatic sacrifices, but the quiet, daily choice to keep living despite everything. To love without controlling. To protect without stealing. To survive the wreckage of other people's obsessions and build something better from what remains. The blood oath was broken the moment Kiva held her nephew and chose him over